everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to do my first check-in for nonfiction November. So it's been a little over a week, and I have completed 3 books for nonfiction November, and I am currently in progress on 3 more books, one of which is actually fiction, but we'll get to that. So I just want to do a quick check-in with what books I've read and talk a little bit about what I'm currently reading. So the first book that I finished this week was Trick Mirror by Tolentino. This was a collection of essays written by Miss Tolentino, and it's sort of she's I think around 30 years old, so it's like a millennial take on politics and culture and sort of like television and internet stuff and all of that. I found the collection to be quite uneven. I liked some essays quite well. I didn't like other essays. I felt quite a few of the essays were really long for an essay. Like there are 8 essays in total in the collection, and some of them went on like for an extremely long period of time, I felt. So that was a tick in the negative column for me. But there were 2 essays in particular that I really enjoyed. And the first one was The Story of a Generation and 7 Scams. And it's sort of about how, particularly in today's culture, there are all these sort of scams that people buy into, and I don't know that it's anything particularly new to this era, but she very clearly delineates sort of the major scams of this generation, culminating with Trump becoming president. So I thought that essay was very well done. And then another essay, We Come from Old Virginia. Tolentino went to I think UVA, which I can't remember, is that University of Virginia? Anyway, a Southern university, and she had bought in sort of to the whole fraternity, sorority culture, the whole football culture, all of that stuff, very traditional, big university type campus culture. And then as she becomes a young writer for, I don't remember which publication, but it was an online publication, as she's in her early 20s, she's just barely out of college, she's starting her career as a writer, and rape allegations come out about one of the fraternities from her campus, or from her alma mater. And then she sort of has to face the prevailing rape culture that's happening on campuses in the United States, in college campuses in the United States, and how that is so pervasive, and how she has been, not necessarily part of the problem, but basically not looking at the problem head on, as many of us do when we're not directly impacted with a problem like rape culture. We sort of look away and we overlook a lot of things that are happening, and she sort of has to come to terms with that herself, and also with her alma mater, which she feels very strongly, that she had a good experience going to college there. And I thought that was all very, very interesting, and I think is a very strong essay in terms of how we as a culture process things like rape on college campuses, and how our attitudes about those kind of social issues changes depending on our own personal experience with those issues. And the other thing is, Tolentino is an author of color, so she sort of approaches a lot of these issues from the point of view of a person of color as well, and so that's an interesting perspective to have too. So I definitely think it's a collection that's worthwhile. I just didn't love the whole thing in its entirety. I had then completed my first book off my TBR for nonfiction November. This is In the Garden of Beasts, Love, Terror, and an American Family in Hitler's Berlin by Eric Larson. This tells the story of the ambassador to Germany right prior to the outbreak of World War II and Hitler's sort of takeover of Germany. His name was William Dodd, and he did not have any experience in the diplomatic corps, but he was a history professor and was nominated and put into the position by Roosevelt, by FDR, and he felt very strongly that his job was to sort of bring forth the American ideals of democracy into Germany and to lead by example in the times of the great economic struggles that were happening in the United States and around the world at that time, as we were, in the Great Depression, that he needed to live within his means and his salaries as an ambassador. And that, of course, was very contrary to how diplomatic relations were carried out, which was mainly by wealthy people who were put into those positions, and they sort of used their own personal wealth to throw elaborate parties and to basically demonstrate the strength and economic might of the United States through their own personal expenditures. And Dodd was very much against all of that, and he was very much against sort of going into Germany and telling the German government what to do. He was more there to set a good example and to try to encourage people to see things from his point of view, but that didn't go very well, let's just say. Dodd also brings his daughter Martha and his son Bill Jr. and his wife with him to his posting in Berlin. And so we see all of the historical events of the leading up to Hitler's assumption of power in Germany and World War II through their eyes as well, mostly from the eyes of his daughter Martha, who was quite the person. She is quite... how to describe Martha? She's not an easy person to read about. She comes across as very selfish. She seems to be much more interested in pursuing a lot of young men and even older men. She's very interested in her romantic relationships, and also in her sort of view of herself as a person who took risks and lived on the edge and all of that kind of thing. So she comes into Germany very naive and sees all these handsome young men that are part of the Nazi party, and sort of allows herself to believe in the romantic viewpoint of Nazism. And so she's difficult to take throughout this book. I found this book interesting as a look into this period of history, this very specific period of the early 1930s in Berlin, in Germany, and what was happening within that country as opposed to what the rest of the world was doing, which was basically trying to appease Hitler in the hopes of that he would just go away. They just thought if they ignored him long enough, he would go away. That didn't end well either. And there are a lot of parallels in this book to things that are happening today in the United States and other countries where there's been this rise of alt-right and highly far-right political ideology. So that was disturbing as well. But overall, this was not my favorite Erik Larson book. I very much preferred his book about the hurricane in Galveston and his book about the Chicago World's Fair, The Devil in the White City, to this one, but it was still a good read. I very much enjoyed buddy reading this with Doris. We had some great conversations as always. So, qualified recommendation on this one. And then this morning, I finished this essay collection, The Best American Science and Nature Writing 2018, which I've been working on since before November started. Again, with this essay collection, I didn't love every essay in here, but this is a very strong collection. There is an essay from Barack Obama talking about climate change, which is really hard to read because he wrote it sort of right at the end of his presidency, and he's talking about how important it is that America continues to be a world leader in climate change stuff, and that we keep our promises with the Paris Agreement and all that, and so that's difficult to read about. There's a neat essay in here about a man who's trying to bring back a Pleistocene park in Russia, up in Siberia, to bring back woolly mammoths and things like that. So that was an interesting article. There's a bunch of stuff in here about what it's like to be a female scientist and to deal with sort of the Me Too movement in the science field. That was really interesting. There's a good article in here by Siddhartha Mukherjee. If you've read some of his stuff, he writes about, let me get this right. I don't want to misquote. He's talking about cancer in this book as well, in his article about a lot of the newest research and breakthroughs in cancer treatments. That's an excellent one. And there is an essay in here by Ed Yong, the author of I Contain Multitudes, which is talked about on BookTube a lot, and he talks about spiders and spiders that how spiders see, and that's really, really interesting as well. So lots of different topics, which is why I really like these collections. It hits on lots of different topics, lots of different scientific disciplines, lots of different perspectives, and I always find that the majority of the essays are very good, and this collection was no exception. And so what I'm currently reading, that's what I finished. What I'm currently reading is I am working my way through The Great Bridge, The Story of the Building of the Brooklyn Bridge by David McCullough. Buddy reading this with Doris, about halfway or a little bit less than halfway through it. This is absolutely fascinating. McCullough is just such a great history writer. He really brings the history to life and all the different people that are involved. This is, of course, about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge in the late 1800s. And so the technology that was brought to bear to get this structure built, which is all new technology. This is the largest suspension bridge that was built at that time period. It was unproven technology, a lot of it. So that's all fascinating. But then the people that are involved, like this was in the same time period with, like the very big scandalous political situation in New York City with Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, and all of those characters come into this story as well. So that's all quite fascinating. Certainly at the point that I'm at right now, sort of almost halfway through, we're learning a lot about the politics of the time and all of the corruption and scandals that were taking place with some of these big construction projects that were happening during, the lead up into basically the Gilded Age. So that's fascinating, and David McCullough handles that very, very well. Very much enjoying that. I started listening to the Frederick Douglass biography. This is by David Blight. And this was not on my original TBR, but I needed an audiobook, and this one was available to me on Scribd. And so I started listening to it, and the narrator is Prentice Onyeme. Is it Onyeme? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but anyway, he is a fabulous audiobook narrator. His voice is like butter. I could listen to him literally all day. I've already listened to 27% of this book on audio, and I started it on Wednesday. So it's really, really good. Frederick Douglass is a fascinating individual. He was obviously born a slave in Maryland and ran away in his late teens and made his way to the North and became a famous abolitionist. And I'm currently in the stage where he's in his late 20s, early 30s. He has a young family. He's starting out his abolitionist career. He's been to England and sort of gone on tour around England. And now he's basically starting his own newspaper in Rochester, New York. Super fascinating. Really enjoying that. And then the last thing that I'm currently reading is a fiction book. I'm buddy reading it with Sean and Kazan, and that's Our Spoons Came from Woolworths by Barbara Comyns. You may have heard Sean talk about our reading of books with Woolworths in the title. This is a book that takes place in early part of the 20th century, I think in the 1930s. We're following a young woman, very naive young woman, as she begins her marriage with a man named Charles, and Charles is an absolute jerk, and she just is completely clueless about what it is to be a wife and a mother. And it's kind of irritating, but also good. So I'm kind of on the fence about it right now, about whether or not it's going to be good or not good. I find the writing style to be very easy to read, but she's so naive. The main character is so naive as to be irritating, and her husband is an absolute ass, so I really don't like reading about him. But the part that I just read, I'm up to page 65 with it, and it's like 200 pages long. So it's interesting, and I'm compelled to keep reading it. So we'll see how that one goes. So that's what I am currently working on. I will be back next week, hopefully, to check in again with how NonFiction November is going. I hope you have been reading a lot of great nonfiction books this month, and I will talk to you later.